Finding fluency through connection, how I learned English without moving abroad. Welcome to Smart English Start. If you've ever felt stuck in your English learning journey, this series is for you. Here, we share real stories of people who found unique ways to improve their English, not just through textbooks, but through real-life experiences. Today, we're sharing the journey of Sophie Martin. Sophie grew up in France, where she studied English for years but struggled to speak fluently. She thought moving abroad was the only way to become fluent, but instead, she found a way to improve her English without ever leaving her home country. Using language exchange apps, AI tools, and real conversations, she transformed her English and became confident in speaking. Let's dive into her story. Episode 1: Why I Couldn't Speak English. Even after years of studying.
Hello, my name is Sophie Martin, and I want to share my journey of learning English without ever leaving France. Like many people, I studied English in school for years. I memorized vocabulary, passed grammar tests, and could even write formal emails. But there was one big problem: I couldn't speak fluently. Whenever I tried to have a conversation, I froze. My mind translated everything from French to English, making me sound unnatural. I took too long to respond, and by the time I found the right words, the conversation had already moved on. I thought, if I don't move to an English-speaking country, I'll never become fluent. But I was wrong. I found a way to improve my English without leaving France, using technology, language apps, and real conversations with people online. This is my story. Arriving at my first English conversation class. I first realized how bad my speaking skills were when I joined an English conversation class in Lyon. The teacher asked each student to introduce themselves. When it was my turn, I felt my hands get sweaty. I had studied English for years, but suddenly my mind went blank. I managed to say, "Hello, my name is Sophie. I live in France. I like travel." That was it. My sentences were short, my pronunciation was bad, and I couldn't express my thoughts the way I wanted. Meanwhile, another student from Spain spoke confidently, telling a story about her last vacation. She made mistakes, but she kept talking naturally. I realized that my biggest problem wasn't vocabulary or grammar. It was confidence. I was too afraid of making mistakes, so I barely spoke at all. Trying traditional learning methods. After that class, I decided to improve. I tried everything: YouTube videos, grammar books, even listening to podcasts every morning. But the problem was, I was still only listening and reading. I wasn't actually speaking. One day, I was watching an interview with an English teacher who said, "The only way to improve your speaking is to actually speak every day." That made me realize I had been studying English passively. I needed a way to actually practice speaking. Discovering language exchange apps. That's when I found Tandem and HelloTalk, apps where you can chat with native speakers who want to learn your language. I signed up and started texting with a few English speakers who were learning French. It was fun, and I learned some casual phrases, but I knew that texting wasn't enough. One day, one of my language partners sent me a message. "Sophie, do you want to have a voice call?" I stared at the screen, feeling nervous. Speaking with a real person was different from texting. I would have to respond in real time, without thinking too much, but I said yes. The next day, I had my first English conversation on a voice call. It was awkward, I hesitated a lot, and I made many mistakes. But after 20 minutes, something amazing happened. I stopped thinking in French and just started speaking. Episode 2: How I used AI and speaking apps to improve my English. I started using language exchange apps to practice with native speakers, and while that helped, I still had a problem. I lacked confidence in my pronunciation and fluency. When I spoke, I hesitated too much. My sentences didn't flow naturally, and sometimes my pronunciation made it hard for people to understand me. I needed a way to practice speaking on my own before having real conversations. That's when I discovered AI and speaking apps. The problem with traditional speaking practice. At first, I tried repeating after YouTube videos, but the problem was, no one corrected me. I had no idea if my pronunciation was good or if I sounded unnatural. I thought about getting a tutor, but private lessons were expensive. That's when I started looking for AI tools that could help me practice alone, anytime I wanted. Using AI and speaking apps to train my fluency. I tried a few different apps, but these were the ones that helped me the most. ChatGPT. I used it to simulate real conversations. I typed, "Let's pretend I'm ordering coffee in New York," and practiced different ways to order. It corrected my mistakes and suggested more natural phrases. Elsa Speak. This app helped me analyze my pronunciation and gave instant feedback on how to improve my sounds. Native Champ. This app provided structured speaking exercises, helping me practice listening and speaking at the same time. For the first time, I had a way to train my English speaking daily, without needing a teacher or a language partner. How AI helped me speak faster and more naturally. One of my biggest problems was thinking too much before speaking. I would form a sentence in French, translate it in my head, and then say it in English. This made my speech slow and unnatural, so I started using ChatGPT in voice mode, where I had to speak my responses out loud instead of typing them. At first, I took too long to answer, but after a few days, I started responding faster. The AI encouraged me to keep speaking, so I got used to making mistakes and continuing the conversation. I used it for daily conversation practice, ordering food, talking about my day, and even job interview practice. After 1 month of daily practice, I noticed something amazing. I no longer hesitated as much in real conversations. My first time speaking fluently without thinking. One evening, I had a video call with my language exchange partner, Jack. We were talking about our weekend plans when he suddenly said, "Sophie, your English sounds getting better." That's when I realized I had just spoken for 5 minutes straight, without translating in my head. I wasn't perfect, but I sounded confident and natural for the first time. Episode 3. Bringing English into my daily life. The problem was, I was still in France. I wasn't surrounded by native speakers. I couldn't just walk outside and start talking to people in English, so I had to get creative. I found ways to bring English into my daily life, even while living in my home country, and that changed everything. Surrounding myself with English every day. I decided to switch my daily routine into English as much as possible. I changed my phone's language to English. I set my social media feeds to only show content in English. I stopped watching TV shows with subtitles in my native language. At first, it felt strange, but within a few weeks, I started thinking in English more naturally. Practicing real conversations without traveling. I wanted to speak English daily, but I didn't have native speakers around me. So, I found ways to create real conversations even while staying in France. I joined online English discussion groups on platforms like Reddit and Discord. I started voice messaging instead of texting, forcing myself to speak instead of type. I used AI chat tools like ChatGPT in conversation mode to practice quick, natural exchanges. One of the biggest game changers? I started using Uber in English. Whenever I ordered a ride, I would switch my settings to request English-speaking drivers. That way, I could have small talk in English during every ride. Using English in social situations. One day, I decided to push myself even more. I went to a language exchange meetup in Lyon, where I had to speak English with strangers for an entire evening. At first, I felt nervous. What if I made mistakes? What if people didn't understand me? But then, I remembered something my AI language coach had taught me. Confidence is more important than perfection. So, I stopped focusing on being grammatically perfect and just spoke naturally. And for the first time, I had a real fluent conversation in English with zero hesitation. The moment I realized I was becoming fluent. A few days later, I was on a video call with Jack, my language exchange partner. We were talking about funny travel stories when he said, "Wait, Sophie, have you noticed something? You're not pausing anymore." I hadn't even realized it, but I had just spoken for 10 minutes straight without stopping to think. That was the moment I knew English had become part of my life. I wasn't just learning it anymore, I was living it. Episode 4: Learning to sound more natural in English. Even though I was speaking more fluently, my English still sounded a little unnatural. The words were correct, but the way I said them was different from how native speakers spoke. I wanted to fix that. So I started focusing on the little details, intonation, rhythm, and expressions that make English sound truly natural. The problem, I still sounded like a student. When I listened to myself speak, I noticed something. My English sounded too formal. I spoke in short, choppy sentences instead of flowing naturally. I used textbook phrases instead of the way people actually talk. My intonation was too flat, making my speech sound robotic. For example, if someone asked me, "How was your weekend?" I would say, "It was good. I met my friends. We ate dinner." Grammatically correct? Yes. Natural? Not really. Needed to start speaking the way real people do in casual conversations? Step 1: Learning native phrasing from real conversations. I knew that if I wanted to sound more natural, I had to listen closely to how native speakers actually talk. So, I started paying attention to how people shorten words, gonna instead of going to, lemme instead of let me, filler words and small talk expressions, like, I mean. How questions sound more natural. How was your weekend? Instead of, tell me about your weekend. I used ChatGPT in conversation mode and asked, can you make my sentence sound more natural? For example, instead of saying, I want to improve my speaking skills, I'm trying to get better at speaking. Small changes, but a huge difference in sounding natural. Step 2: Practicing intonation and rhythm. I realized that English is not just about words, it's about rhythm. In French, we speak smoothly, but in English, people stress certain words and use up and down tones. I started practicing by shadowing native speakers. I would play a podcast and repeat what they said, copying their tone and speed. Recording myself and comparing my speech to native speakers. Practicing everyday sentences with different intonations like, really, as a question, really, as a statement, really, as a reaction. Once I started using intonation naturally, my English sounded less robotic and more expressive. Step 3: Using more natural expressions in daily conversations. I also started replacing textbook phrases with real-life expressions. Instead of, that is interesting, I said, oh wow, really? Instead of, I think that is correct, I said, sounds about right. The result? People responded to me more naturally, and conversations started feeling more fun and less stressful. The moment I realized I sounded natural. One evening, I was on a call with Jack. We were joking about bad restaurant experiences when I said, that was such a rip-off. I mean, come on. Jack laughed and said, Sophie, you sound like a native speaker now. I didn't just speak English anymore. I sounded like someone who had been speaking it naturally for years. Episode 5: The moment I started thinking in English. Every time I spoke, my brain first created the sentence in French, then tried to translate it into English. This made my speech slower and less natural. I knew that if I wanted to be truly fluent, I needed to start thinking directly in English. So, I changed the way I used English every day. And one day, without even realizing it, something incredible happened. Step 1: Making English my default language. I decided to switch my brain into English mode as much as possible. I changed all my daily tasks to English. My to-do lists, my grocery lists, even my reminders. I narrated my day in English. While cooking, walking, or cleaning, I spoke to myself in English about what I was doing. I forced myself to describe things around me in English instead of French. At first, it was hard. My brain wanted to think in French, but after a few weeks, I noticed something. I didn't have to translate as much anymore. Words started coming instantly. Step 2. Speaking without planning. I used to plan my sentences before speaking. I would think, okay, how do I say this in English? But that made me sound unnatural and slow. So I started forcing myself to speak without thinking too much. If I had a language exchange call, I didn't prepare. If I made a mistake, I kept going instead of stopping to correct myself. At first, I made a lot of small mistakes, but I realized that native speakers don't speak perfectly all the time either. The goal wasn't perfection, it was flow and confidence. Step 3. Immersing myself in natural conversations. I wanted to make sure I was always surrounded by English, so I changed my daily habits. I listened to English podcasts in the morning instead of French news. I read English articles and books every night. I talked to myself in English before bed about my day. Slowly, English became less of a foreign language and more of a natural part of my life. The moment I realized I was thinking in English. One day, I was walking through Lyon, lost in thought. I was thinking about my weekend plans, what I needed to buy, and what I would eat for dinner. And suddenly, I stopped. I had been thinking about everything in English, without even noticing it. That was the moment I knew I wasn't just learning English anymore. It had become part of me. Even now, I'm still learning new words, improving my pronunciation, and discovering better ways to express myself. But I no longer feel afraid. Fluency isn't about speaking perfectly. It's about thinking in the language, reacting naturally, and using it in everyday life. Make mistakes, but keep going. One day, without realizing it, you'll find yourself thinking in English naturally. And that's the moment you'll know you're truly fluent. Enjoy the process.